Margaret Chen sat in the small waiting room backstage, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The sound of music and cheering from the main stage echoed through the thin walls. She wore her best dress, a navy blue one with small white flowers that she had bought for her grandson's wedding 3 years ago. Her silver hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and she carried a small purse that had seen better days. At 78 years old, Margaret looked exactly like what she was, a grandmother from a quiet town in Ohio. The other contestants in the waiting area were much younger, dressed in flashy outfits, practicing their dance moves or vocal exercises. A few of them glanced at her with puzzled looks, probably wondering if she was lost or waiting for someone else. Margaret's journey to this moment had started 6 months earlier, when her granddaughter Katie visited for Christmas. Katie had found her grandmother playing piano in the small living room, as she did every evening after dinner. But that night something was different. Margaret was playing a piece so beautiful and complex that Katie stopped talking mid-sentence and just listened. "Grandma, that was incredible," Katie had said when the music ended. "I've never heard you play anything like that before." Margaret smiled and closed the piano lid gently. "Oh, that was just something I learned a long time ago, dear." But Katie wouldn't let it go. Over the next few days, she kept asking questions. She learned that her grandmother had once been accepted to study at one of the most famous music schools in the country. She discovered that Margaret had given up her dreams to take care of her sick mother during hard times in the 1960s. Most shocking of all, Katie found out that her grandmother still practiced for hours every day, playing pieces that most professional pianists would find challenging. "You have to audition for that talent show," Katie had insisted before leaving. "Promise me you'll think about it." Margaret had laughed it off at first. Who would want to see an old woman play piano on television? But as the weeks passed, the idea wouldn't leave her mind. She found herself playing with more passion, imagining what it would feel like to share her music with more than just the empty chairs in her living room. The application process had been surprisingly simple. She filled out forms online with Katie's help, recorded a short video of herself playing on Katie's phone, and sent it in. When they called to tell her she had been selected for the live auditions, Margaret nearly dropped the phone. Now, sitting in this bright waiting room with its white walls and uncomfortable chairs, Margaret wondered if she had made a huge mistake. The young woman sitting across from her was practicing what looked like acrobatics, bending her body in ways that seemed impossible. To her left, a man with colorful hair was juggling while riding a small unicycle. Everyone seemed so confident, so sure they belonged here. A production assistant with a clipboard and headset approached Margaret. "Are you Margaret Chen?" she asked, looking down at her notes with a slightly confused expression. "Yes, that's me," Margaret replied softly. "And you're here to play piano?" The assistant's voice had a tone that suggested she might have mixed up some paperwork. "Yes, dear. I play piano." The assistant looked around the room, then back at Margaret. "Okay, well, you'll be going on in about 10 minutes. Do you need anything? Water? A bathroom break?" Margaret shook her head politely. "No, thank you, I'm fine." As the assistant walked away, Margaret heard her talking quietly into her headset. "Yeah, we have the elderly piano lady up next." I know. Just keep the cameras ready for whatever happens." Margaret pretended not to hear, but the words stung a little. She understood why people might doubt her. In a world where youth and flashiness often got the most attention, a quiet grandmother from Ohio didn't seem like much competition. But Margaret had something that couldn't be seen from the outside. She had spent 60 years perfecting her craft, playing through joy and sorrow, through quiet mornings and long evenings. Her fingers had memorized thousands of pieces, from simple children's songs to the most complex compositions ever written. Music wasn't just her hobby. It was the language her soul spoke best. The sounds from the main stage grew louder as another act finished their performance. Margaret could hear the judges making comments, though she couldn't make out the words. The audience's reactions varied, sometimes excited cheering, sometimes polite clapping, and occasionally an uncomfortable silence that probably meant someone's performance hadn't gone well. Next up, Margaret Chen called a different production assistant. Margaret stood up slowly, smoothing down her dress and checking that her hair was still in place. Her hands weren't shaking, which surprised her. After all these years of playing only for herself and small church gatherings, she had expected to feel more nervous about performing in front of thousands of people and television cameras. As she walked toward the stage entrance, She passed the contestant who had just finished, a young man who looked disappointed and was being comforted by what appeared to be his family. Margaret gave him an encouraging smile as she passed. The bright lights of the stage hit her as soon as she stepped out from behind the curtain. The audience seemed enormous, stretching back into darkness beyond the lights. She could see the judges sitting at their table, looking up at her with expressions that ranged from curious to slightly amused. The large piano sat in the center of the stage, looking both familiar and intimidating under the powerful spotlights. Margaret walked slowly across the stage, her comfortable shoes making soft sounds on the polished floor. She could hear some murmuring from the audience, probably people wondering what this elderly woman was doing on a stage usually reserved for singers, dancers, and variety acts. When she reached the center of the stage, she stopped and gave a small wave to the audience. Some people clapped politely, the kind of encouraging applause you might give to a child at a school recital. Margaret didn't mind. She had learned long ago that respect had to be earned, especially in a world that often overlooked people like her. The head judge, known for his sharp tongue and tougher critiques, leaned forward in his chair. Margaret could see him trying to figure out what exactly she was planning to do. His expression suggested he was already preparing for either a disaster or a novelty act that would provide a few minutes of light entertainment. Margaret approached the piano bench and adjusted it slightly, to the right height. She had learned to do this quickly and efficiently over the years, adapting to different pianos in different places. Her hands rested lightly on the keyboard cover, and for a moment everything was quiet except for the distant hum of the air conditioning and the soft murmur of the crowd. This was it. After 60 years of playing in empty rooms and small church halls, Margaret Chen was about to share her gift with the world. She had no idea that in the next few minutes she would change not only her own life, but touch the hearts of millions of people who would see her performance and remember that dreams never truly die. They just wait patiently for their moment to shine. The head judge, Stephen Cross, looked up from his notes and smiled in that way people do when they're trying to be kind but aren't quite sure what they're dealing with. He was famous for his brutal honesty on television, but even he seemed to soften slightly when faced with Margaret standing quietly beside the large black piano. "Well, hello there," he said, his voice carrying across the silent auditorium through his microphone. "And you are?" "Margaret Chen," she replied, her voice clear but soft. A production assistant quickly adjusted her microphone so everyone could hear her better. "Margaret Chen," Stephen repeated, glancing at his fellow judges. "And how old are you, Margaret?" "I'm 78 years old," Margaret answered without hesitation. A small wave of surprised murmurs rippled through the audience. Some people seemed impressed that someone her age would have the courage to get on stage, while others appeared to be settling in for what they expected would be either a sweet but simple performance or an unintentional comedy act. Judge Patricia Williams, known for being the encouraging voice among the panel, leaned forward with genuine interest. 78. That's wonderful. And what brings you here today, Margaret? Margaret took a small breath before answering. "I'd like to play piano for you." "Piano?" exclaimed the third judge, David Park, who was younger than the other two and had a reputation for being the most unpredictable. "That's fantastic. We don't get many piano acts. What kind of music do you like to play?" "Well," Margaret said, "I enjoy classical music mostly. I studied it many years ago." Stephen raised an eyebrow. "You studied classical piano? Where did you study?" For the first time since stepping onto the stage, Margaret looked slightly uncomfortable. She seemed to debate whether to share this information. "I was accepted to study at a music conservatory when I was young, but I wasn't able to finish my studies there." "Oh, that's a shame," Patricia said sympathetically. "What happened?" "My mother became very ill and someone needed to take care of her. So I came home and became a piano teacher instead," Margaret explained simply, as if this life-changing sacrifice was just a normal part of growing up. The judges exchanged glances. Stephen's expression showed he was trying to piece together what kind of performance he should expect. David looked genuinely curious while Patricia seemed touched by Margaret's story. "And have you been teaching piano all these years?" Patricia asked. "I taught for 45 years at the elementary school in my town. I retired about 15 years ago, but I still play every day," Margaret said. "Every day?" David seemed impressed. "After all these years, you still practice every day?" Margaret nodded. "Music has been my closest friend for most of my life. Some people read books every day or watch television. I play piano. Stephen looked down at his papers again, probably checking what song Margaret had listed for her audition. His eyebrows shot up slightly and he looked back at her with an expression that was hard to read. It says here you're planning to play Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, Stephen said slowly. Is that correct? The other judges looked surprised. Even people in the audience who knew classical music seemed taken aback. This was not a simple piece by any standards. It was one of the most technically demanding and emotionally complex pieces in the classical piano repertoire. Yes, that's right, Margaret confirmed calmly. David let out a low whistle. Margaret, that's quite an ambitious choice. That piece is incredibly difficult. Are you sure you wouldn't prefer to play something a bit more manageable? The way he said manageable made it clear that he thought she was in over her head. Some people in the audience began to whisper among themselves. A few could be heard chuckling, not maliciously, but in the way people do when they think someone elderly is being adorably overconfident. Stephen leaned back in his chair, and his professional smile took on a slightly sharper edge. Margaret, I have to ask, do you understand what you're attempting here? Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto is one of the most challenging pieces ever written. Professional concert pianists spend months preparing to perform it. Margaret's expression remained calm and polite. I understand it's difficult, yes. Difficult? Stephen continued, and now his voice had that tone that made him famous on television, the one that suggested he was about to deliver a hard truth. Margaret, with all due respect, this piece requires not just technical skill but physical strength and stamina. It's over 30 minutes long in its full form. Are you planning to play the entire thing? I thought I would play a portion of it, Margaret replied. The parts that I think would be most interesting for the audience. Patricia jumped in, clearly trying to save Margaret from what appeared to be heading toward embarrassment. Margaret, dear, we love that you want to challenge yourself, but maybe we could hear something a little simpler first. Perhaps a nice classical piece that shows off your skills without being quite so demanding. The condescension in her voice was gentle but unmistakable. She was speaking to Margaret the way adults speak to children who have announced they want to climb Mount Everest for their weekend adventure. I appreciate your concern, Margaret said quietly, but this is the piece I've prepared. Stephen shook his head slightly and looked at his fellow judges. Well, Margaret, far be it from us to talk you out of it. You came here to perform, and we're here to listen. But his tone suggested that he expected this to be a quick and possibly painful experience for everyone involved. The audience could sense the judge's skepticism, and the energy in the room shifted. What had started as curious anticipation was now becoming something closer to awkward. Anticipation, the feeling you get when you're about to watch someone attempt something they're clearly not equipped to. Handle camera operators positioned themselves for what they obviously expected to be a brief segment. One cameraman could be seen adjusting his equipment, probably preparing to capture reaction shots from the audience, when Margaret's performance inevitably fell short of the impossibly high bar she had set for herself. David tried one more time. Margaret, are you absolutely certain about this choice? We want you to succeed here. Maybe something by Mozart or Bach. Something beautiful but not quite so technically demanding. Margaret walked over to the piano bench and sat down carefully. She adjusted the bench height with small, precise movements, the way someone does when they've done this thousands of times before. Her hands rested lightly on her knees as she looked back at the judges. Gentlemen, ladies, she said, and for the first time, her voice carried just a hint of something stronger than politeness. I've been playing this piece for almost 60 years. I know it may seem like an unusual choice, but I'd like to share it with you. The firmness in her voice surprised everyone, including the judges. This wasn't the uncertain elderly woman they had been expecting. There was something in Margaret's tone that suggested she knew exactly what she was doing, even if no one else believed it. Stephen sat back in his chair and folded his arms. His expression now clearly said, well, this ought to be interesting. Not interesting in a good way, but interesting in the way that train wrecks are interesting. You can't look away even though you know it's not going to end well. All right, Margaret, he said. The stage is yours. Margaret turned to face the piano, placed her hands gently on the keyboard cover, and took a quiet, deep breath. The entire auditorium fell silent, 15,000 people waiting to see what would happen when an elderly piano teacher from Ohio attempted to perform one of classical music's greatest challenges. None of them had any idea they were about to witness something extraordinary. Margaret lifted the keyboard cover and set it gently to the side. The piano was a beautiful concert grand, much larger and more impressive than the old upright piano she played at home every day. But pianos were pianos, and she had played on many different ones over the years. Some good, some terrible, some that had seen better days. She placed her fingers on the keys without pressing them yet, feeling the smooth surface and the familiar spacing. This was always her ritual before playing anything important. Her hands needed to say hello to the instrument first, to understand its voice and personality. The audience grew restless in their seats. 15,000 people don't stay quiet for very long, and whispers began to flutter through the vast space like leaves in a gentle wind. Some people shifted in their chairs, probably wondering how long this was going to take. Judge Stephen Cross tapped his pen against his notepad impatiently. He glanced at his watch, then at his fellow judges. David Park was leaning forward slightly, genuinely curious about what was going to happen. Patricia Williams had her hands folded and was wearing the kind of encouraging smile adults give to children about to attempt something brave, but probably doomed. In the balcony section, a teenage girl turned to her mother and whispered, "Why is this taking so long? When is she going to start playing?" Her mother shushed her, but several people nearby had heard the question and were wondering the same thing. Margaret took one more quiet breath and gently pressed. The first few keys, the opening notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, are soft and haunting. They don't announce themselves with drama or force. Instead, they creep into a room like dawn breaking slowly over a lake, so beautiful and natural that you almost don't notice them until they're already inside your heart. The first few notes drifted across the silent auditorium, pure and clear. Margaret's touch was incredibly gentle, yet every note rang with perfect clarity. The piano seemed to whisper rather than speak, and somehow that whisper was more powerful than any shout could have been. In the front row, an elderly man who had come to support his granddaughter's singing act stopped fidgeting with his program. Something about those first notes made him sit perfectly still and listen. Stephen Cross had been looking down at his papers, probably preparing his comments for when this was over. But the quality of those opening notes made him look up. His expression changed from patient tolerance to something closer to surprise. Margaret continued playing, her fingers moving across the keys with fluid grace. The melody began to build, still soft but growing more complex. Her left hand joined her right, creating a gentle harmony that seemed to make the air in the huge auditorium feel warmer somehow. A woman in the middle section nudged her husband and pointed toward the stage. She had expected to see an elderly woman struggling with a difficult piece of music. Instead, she saw someone whose entire body seemed to flow with the music. Margaret's shoulders moved naturally with the rhythm, her head swayed slightly with the melody, and her hands appeared to dance rather than work. The camera operators, who had been positioned to capture what they expected to be a brief and possibly embarrassing performance, found themselves adjusting their equipment. Instead of preparing for quick cutaway shots to the judges' reactions, they were zooming in on Margaret's hands, trying to capture the incredible precision and grace of her playing. David Park's mouth fell open slightly. He had heard this piece performed many times before in concert halls around the world. He knew what good piano playing sounded like, and this was not what he had expected from a retired elementary school teacher from Ohio. This was something else entirely. The music continued to build, and Margaret moved into more technically challenging passages. Her fingers began to move faster, dancing across the keys in patterns that would challenge pianists half her age. But there was no strain in her movements, no tension in her shoulders or arms. She played as if this incredibly difficult music was as natural as breathing. A young man who played piano himself was sitting in the upper balcony, nigh with his girlfriend. He had studied music in college and thought he knew good piano playing when he heard it. He leaned forward in his seat, straining to see Margaret's hands as they moved across the keyboard.
"This is impossible," he whispered to his girlfriend.
No one her age should be able to play like this. The melody grew more dramatic and Margaret's playing became more powerful without losing any of its precision. Her left hand created deep, rich bass notes that seemed to make the entire auditorium vibrate, while her right hand wove intricate melodies that sparkled like stars against the darker background. Stephen Cross put down his pen entirely. His reputation was built on being the tough judge, the one who could spot fake talent from a mile away and wasn't afraid to say so. But what he was hearing from this quiet grandmother was making him question everything he thought he knew about this audition. Patricia Williams had tears beginning to form in her eyes, though she wasn't quite sure why yet. There was something about the way Margaret played that went beyond technical skill. The music seemed to carry emotions and experiences that could only come from someone who had lived a full life and found beauty in both its joys and sorrows. In the audience, conversations had stopped completely. People who had been checking their phones put them away. Children who had been restless became perfectly still. Even the ushers standing in the aisles found themselves leaning against the walls and listening instead of doing their usual jobs. Margaret moved into a passage that was both technically demanding and emotionally intense. Her hands flew across the keys, playing notes so quickly they seemed to blur together. Yet each one was crystal clear and perfectly timed. The music swelled and filled every corner of the massive space, reaching the furthest balcony and the highest ceiling. A professional music critic who had come to review the show for a major newspaper put down his notepad entirely. In 30 years of reviewing classical music performances, he had rarely heard anything this beautiful. The fact that it was coming from someone the judges had clearly expected to fail made it even more extraordinary. The transformation happening on stage was remarkable. The uncertain elderly woman who had shuffled out from behind the curtain was gone. In her place sat a master musician, completely lost in the music she was creating. Margaret's face showed pure concentration and joy, the expression of someone doing exactly what they were born to do. Her playing grew even more powerful, and the audience began to lean forward in their seats without realizing it. Some people found themselves holding their breath during the most delicate passages, then sighing with relief and pleasure when Margaret navigated them perfectly. A little girl sitting with her parents tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mommy," she whispered, "the music is making me feel happy and sad at the same time." Her mother nodded, unable to explain that this was exactly what great music was supposed to do. Judge David Park looked at his fellow judges with an expression of complete amazement. They had all been prepared for this to be a quick, possibly awkward interlude before moving on to the next act. Instead, they were witnessing something that none of them would ever forget. Margaret continued playing, building toward what the audience could sense would be an incredible climax. Her hands moved with impossible speed and precision, creating layers of sound that seemed to tell an entire life story in musical form. The auditorium had become completely silent, except for the magnificent sound of the piano. 15,000 people sat transfixed, watching this remarkable woman share her gift with the world. And this was only the beginning. As Margaret entered the most challenging section of the concerto, something extraordinary happened. The transformation that had begun with the first gentle notes was now complete. The elderly woman who had walked hesitantly onto the stage had vanished entirely, replaced by a force of pure musical genius. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with breathtaking speed and precision. Notes cascaded from the piano like water flowing over rocks, each one perfect and clear despite the incredible complexity of what she was playing. The technical demands of this passage would challenge concert pianists who practiced 8 hours a day, yet Margaret navigated every twist and turn as if she had written the music herself. Judge Stephen Cross found himself gripping the edge of the table. His reputation was built on maintaining control, on never being surprised by what happened on his stage. But what he was witnessing shattered every assumption he had made about this quiet woman from Ohio. His mouth was slightly open, and for perhaps the first time in his television career, he was completely speechless. In the audience, a professional pianist named Robert, who had come to watch with his family, was recording the performance on his phone with shaking hands. He had studied this exact piece for 2 years in college and had never been able to master it completely. Watching Margaret play it with such effortless perfection was like watching someone solve an impossible puzzle while blindfolded. "Dad," his 10-year-old daughter whispered, tugging on his sleeve. "Why are you crying?" Robert hadn't even realized tears were streaming down his face. "Because, honey," he whispered back, his voice thick with emotion, "we're watching something magic happen." Margaret's playing grew even more powerful. Her left hand created thunderous bass notes that seemed to make the entire building vibrate, while her right hand wove melodies so intricate and beautiful that several people in the audience gasped audibly. The music told a story of triumph over hardship, of dreams deferred but never forgotten, of a lifetime spent loving something so deeply that it became part of your soul. Patricia Williams was openly crying now, no longer trying to hide her tears. She had judged thousands of performances over the years, but she had never experienced anything like this. The music seemed to reach inside her chest and squeeze her heart with gentle, knowing hands. She looked at her fellow judges and saw her own amazement reflected in their faces. Behind the stage, crew members who had been setting up equipment for the next act had stopped working entirely. Sound technicians stood frozen at their control boards, afraid that any movement might somehow disturb the perfection flowing from the stage. The makeup artist who had been preparing the next contestant had put down her brushes and was listening with tears in her eyes. An elderly gentleman in the third row was transported back to 1962, when he had first heard this piece played by a famous Russian pianist in Carnegie Hall. He had been a young soldier on leave then, and the music had made him decide to propose to his girlfriend when he returned home. Now, 50 years later, holding his wife's hand in this auditorium, Margaret's performance brought back every emotion from that long-ago evening. The music built to an incredible crescendo. Margaret's entire body moved with the rhythm now, not in any theatrical way, but as if the music was flowing through her like a river finding its path to the sea. Her shoulders swayed with the melody, her head moved with the phrasing, and her hands seemed to float above the keys even as they struck them with perfect force and timing. David Park had pulled out his own phone and was trying to capture this moment, knowing that no recording could truly capture what was happening in this room. The energy, the emotion, the sheer disbelief that someone they had all underestimated so completely could create something this beautiful. It was beyond anything technology could preserve. A music teacher named Helen, who had brought her advanced students to the show, was frantically taking mental notes. She knew she would spend years trying to explain to her students what she was witnessing. Technical perfection was one thing. She had heard that before. But Margaret was playing with a depth of feeling and understanding that could only come from decades of living with this music, breathing it, making it part of her daily existence. The young cameraman who had been expecting to film a quick, possibly embarrassing segment found himself following Margaret's hands with an artist's eye. Through his lens, he could see the incredible precision of her finger placement, the perfect curve of her wrists, the way she seemed to coax impossible beauty from an instrument that had probably been played by hundreds of performers, none of whom had made it sing quite like this. Margaret moved into the final section of her performance, and the music took on an almost spiritual quality. Every note seemed to carry the weight of her 78 years, all the students she had taught, all the quiet evenings spent playing for an audience of empty chairs, all the dreams she had set aside to care for others. But there was no sadness in the music now, only a profound joy and gratitude for this moment when she could finally share her gift with the world. A young couple in the balcony had come to the show on their first date. Neither of them particularly liked classical music, but they found themselves holding hands without realizing it, both of them moved by something they couldn't quite understand but knew was important. Years later, they would tell their children about the night they heard an elderly woman change their understanding of what music could be. Stephen Cross looked at the timer on his desk and realized that Margaret had been playing for nearly 15 minutes. Normally, acts were limited to 3 or 4 minutes at most. But no one, not the judges, not the production staff, not a single person in the audience, wanted this to end. Time seemed to have stopped, sting only in the space between one note and the next. The music reached its emotional peak and Margaret's playing became transcendent. Her hands moved with impossible grace across the keys, creating sounds that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the physical piano. The melody soared and dove, whispered and roared, painted pictures of love and loss and redemption that needed no words because they spoke directly to the human heart. Backstage, the next performer, a young singer who had been warming up her voice, had stopped her exercises entirely. She stood in the wings with the other contestants and crew members, all of them united in silent awe. Some of them had been annoyed about having to wait for their turn on stage, but now they understood they were witnessing something that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. As Margaret approached the final phrases of her performance, the entire auditorium seemed to hold its breath. 15,000 people sat in perfect silence, afraid that any sound might break the spell she had woven around them. The last notes hung in the air like stars, beautiful and pure and seemingly eternal. And then, in the moment of silence that followed, Margaret sat back slightly on the piano bench, placed her hands gently in her lap, and smiled the quiet, satisfied smile of someone who had just shared the most precious part of themselves with the world. The silence stretched for one heartbeat, then two, then three, and then the auditorium exploded. The explosion of sound that erupted from the audience was unlike anything the auditorium had ever experienced. 15,000 people leaped to their feet as one, their applause thunderous and sustained. The sound rolled through the massive space like a tidal wave, building and building until it seemed the very walls might shake apart from the force of it. Margaret sat quietly at the piano bench for a moment, seemingly overwhelmed by the response. She had spent 60 years playing for audiences of one, herself, or small groups at church gatherings. Nothing could have prepared her for this wall of appreciation washing over her from every direction. Judge Stephen Cross was on his feet, his hands raised high above his head as he clapped with an intensity that surprised even himself. The man who had built his career on being the skeptical voice, the one who could spot pretense and mediocrity from a mile away, was applauding with tears streaming down his face. Incredible, he shouted over the noise, though his voice was completely lost in the roar from the crowd. Absolutely incredible. Patricia Williams had given up any attempt to maintain her composure. She was sobbing openly while applauding, her hands moving so fast they were almost a blur. She kept shaking her head in disbelief, mouthing words that no one could hear but everyone could understand. Oh my God. Oh my God. David Park had jumped onto his chair and was clapping above his head like a fan at a sporting event. His usual cool demeanor was completely gone, replaced by the pure joy of someone who had just witnessed something that would change how he thought about music forever. The applause continued for what felt like an eternity. People in the balcony were stomping their feet, creating a rhythmic thunder that added to the wall of sound. Someone started whistling sharply through their fingers, and soon dozens of others joined in. A group of teenagers who had seemed bored earlier were now screaming their approval like they were at a rock concert. Margaret finally stood up from the piano bench, moving slowly and carefully as she always did. She turned toward the audience and gave a small, graceful bow. This simple gesture caused the applause to surge even louder, if that was possible. Some people were jumping up and down in their seats. Others were hugging strangers sitting next to them, united in their amazement at what they had just experienced. A professional music critic who had covered classical performances for 30 years was frantically scribbling notes, trying to capture what he knew would be the most important review of his career. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely write, but he needed to record every detail of this moment, while it was still fresh in his mind. In the VIP section, a famous conductor who had worked with orchestras around the world was wiping tears from his eyes. He had heard this concerto performed hundreds of times by some of the world's greatest pianists, but Margaret's interpretation had revealed layers of emotion and meaning he had never noticed before. He was already thinking about how he could convince her to perform with his orchestra. The applause began to organize itself into a chant. Margaret! 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 The name echoed through the auditorium, growing stronger with each repetition. People who didn't even know her full name were shouting for this woman who had just turned their understanding of talent and aging completely upside down. Stephen finally raised his hands for quiet, though it took several minutes for the audience to calm down enough for anyone to speak. Even then, small bursts of applause kept interrupting the relative silence. Margaret, Stephen began, his voice thick with emotion. In 20 years of judging performances on this stage, I have never, and I mean never, witnessed anything like what you just shared with us. The audience erupted again, forcing him to pause and wait for quiet. When you walked onto this stage tonight, he continued, I'll be honest, I thought I knew what to expect. I was wrong. Completely, utterly wrong. What you just played was not just technically perfect, though it was that. It was not just emotionally moving, though it certainly was that too. What you just gave us was pure magic. Patricia leaned forward in her chair, still struggling to compose herself. Margaret, dear, I need to ask you something. How long have you been playing that piece? Margaret smiled gently. I first learned it when I was 18 years old, just before I had to leave music school. I've been playing it almost every day since then. 60 years, David said, shaking his head in wonder. You've been perfecting this piece for 60 years. I wouldn't say perfecting, Margaret replied modestly. I would say living with it. Getting to know it better, learning what it wanted to say. A woman in the front row called out, "Why did you wait so long to share this with the world?" Margaret considered the question carefully. I suppose I never thought anyone would want to hear an old woman play piano. People don't usually expect much from someone my age. Stephen stood up again, his voice growing stronger. Margaret, on behalf of everyone in this auditorium and everyone who will see this performance in the days to come, I want to thank you for proving us all wrong. You have reminded us that talent has no expiration date, that dreams don't die just because we get older, and that sometimes the most extraordinary gifts come in the most unexpected packages. The voting was unanimous. All 3 judges said yes with an enthusiasm that was unprecedented in the show's history. Margaret would advance to the next round, though everyone in the room already knew that she had won something much more important than any competition. As Margaret made her way off the stage, the standing ovation began again. People reached out to touch her hand as she passed, not like fans grabbing at a celebrity, but like pilgrims touching something sacred. She stopped to shake hands and accept hugs from dozens of people, each one wanting to share in the magic she had created. Backstage, the other contestants who had been waiting for their turns lined up to congratulate her. The young acrobat who had been practicing earlier was crying as she hugged Margaret. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard," she whispered. The crew members, who had seen thousands of performances over the years, gathered around Margaret like she was visiting royalty. The sound engineer who had been working the show for 15 years said it was the first time he had ever forgotten he was at work and just listened like a regular audience member. Within hours, video clips of Margaret's performance were spreading across social media platforms around the world. People were sharing it with messages like, "You have to see this, and this will restore your faith in humanity." The complete video was viewed over 50 million times in the first week alone. News stations picked up the story, interviewing Margaret at her small home in Ohio. She seemed bemused by all the attention, serving tea to reporters while her old upright piano sat quietly in the background. "I'm just glad people enjoyed the music," she said repeatedly. The performance sparked conversations about ageism in entertainment and society. Op-ed writers analyzed how Margaret's treatment by the judges reflected broader assumptions about older adults. Retirement communities reported increased interest in their music programs. Piano teachers around the country said they had elderly students. Inspired by Margaret's example, Margaret used her newfound fame to establish a scholarship fund for music students who couldn't afford formal training. "I want to make sure other people don't have to wait as long as I did to share their gifts," she explained. She continued to advance in the competition, eventually reaching the finals where she performed a piece by Chopin that left the audience in tears once again. But everyone agreed that her first performance, that moment when she transformed from an underestimated elderly woman into a musical genius before their eyes, would be remembered as one of the greatest moments in television history. Margaret Chen had reminded the world that extraordinary people don't always look extraordinary. Sometimes they look like grandmothers from Ohio who have been quietly practicing their craft for 60 years. Wait.